and welcome back to V-Road, CCTCG's weekly Vanguard Podcast. I'm Cole.
And I'm Trey.
And today I've got kind of like more of a rant, I guess, because there's been a lot of weird patterns I've noticed for a really long time with this game that started to come back into my head when they announced a Gondiva and Sol Rayron mask. And that was how people are like, oh man, all these Dragon Tree riches for Keter and Dragon Empire, like they're going up, or people are buying out a bunch of them, or you know they're gonna be a super expensive card for a bad deck or whatever, or, you know, and then it loops around to like, oh wow, the game's the Vanguard's dying because people are making the game more expensive, and looping it all around to like generic cards and how expensive those are, and the age-old adage of how expensive the game can be, when I don't think that's honestly the case, and still like hasn't been and still isn't.
Yeah, it's kind of a tough thing to live with when this does happen. I mean, unfortunately, it does every single time, but it's a bad judge based off of card prices, I think, because if you really look kind of like at the metric of sales over time, like you can see when things are announced and spiked, and then once people start looking at how the lists are actually doing in Japan, things like that, the numbers start to drop, and you know, buyout prices will go down, depending on how good or how well a card is actually used. I mean, it's kind of a bad metric. I mean, there are cards that maintain price, like you know, Brainwash Spoilers are just a generically good card. There are something to be said about staples and like multiple decks that are up there pricier. But at the same time, we've had a bunch of reprints of those. The price has gone down from what they've been. It's just kind of, you know, obviously there are a few scummy people out there who just decide that they're going to buy out all the cheap cards and drive the price up. You read
it. To me, what always like signals like a cheap or affordable card game to me is like just how much it costs at the end of the day to build a deck, not in the middle of like a set coming out, like a release weekend or pre-sale prices or anything like that. Just like if I get somebody into the game right now and they open a pack and they open a cool boss unit, can they make a deck for a reasonable amount of money? And right now, I think that like the answer to that is unequivocally yes. And especially now with set 4 having just come out in English, that is more the case than ever. Levi-Dross, you know, is a really solid deck, about to get a lot better in set 5, and it's very, very, very affordable and doesn't even need to run the generic cards.
Yeah, I mean, the latest sets of Vanguard have been very different because they really have been all encompassing. If you look back towards the sets kind of like set 11, 12, 13 of you know, pre-Divines, there was a little less to it because they were really just deck filling and like adding into other decks. And don't get me wrong, they're still doing that in this set, but if you're looking at building one of the new bosses that are added into the set, most of the main cards you'll run in those decks are like kept in those sets. Or, you know, you'll add staples down the line from other sets. So, yes, things are ridiculously cheap. Like building new Alden, you actually don't necessarily need any of the old Alden cards. You can technically play the deck, you know, all in, you know, an instance for all these decks is all encompassing in this set. And, you know, Alden himself is a $5 card right now. I mean, it's still kind of coming down off pre-sale price. It's not overly expensive. It's very affordable.
Yeah, there's a lot of options, I think, for new players these days, especially compared to, like Trey said, pre-Divines, where you have a lot of sets like set 12, where, you know, there's, man, I don't actually remember if there was any new decks in that besides, I think, Omnigruzia was, like, the only one. And, other than that, there was just like mask units for decks that already existed, and those inherently made you have to get a generic card, which was sort of prohibitively expensive at the time, and that took like current players into a setting where they needed to spend a lot of money to keep up with stuff. But in Divines, you just don't need to at all. Like, it's just not a thing. Like, the way they've introduced decks, starting with like the faded ones and given them support throughout these other sets, it comes down to like, if you want to upgrade a Resile with set 4 stuff, you need one card that you don't even know if you're even gonna run, honestly, and that's fine. Like, a lot of these decks come out the gate pretty strong in a good way. Like, they're never like unfair or anything or pushed too far beyond. Like, I guess you can argue that like maybe Blangmeyer is a bit of a you know, out the gate unreasonably strong, but he's also a very situational deck and wins pretty hard in only certain cases. So altogether, I think the price tag of these decks could still have like a pretty high upfront cost, but that's true of every card game. And it's especially cheap when you know how to navigate the market, which is also true of every card game. Like, if you just buy case splits for like the nation you really like, or even just the 2, you're not really gonna spend that much money over time when you know what you want to play.
Yeah, and the latest sets of Vanguard have been very good about their prices. It's kind of actually almost not worth buying cases for, like, because in reality you could build every deck in this set for kind of like what you would pay for like a nation split type thing. So it's really interesting. Obviously, if you want the higher rarity stuff, things are going to cost more. That's the advantage of getting cases. You get the opportunity to open more expensive things, FFRs, SECs, DSRs, you know, the energy cards, whatever. But at a base level, you know, someone getting straight into the game, it's super, super cheap. It's kind of nice.
Yes, silver rares being added as a rarity starting in Divines just kind of help things get even cheaper, and again, in a good way. Like, it's interesting to think about how there are so many good, solid meta contenders in these new sets that are so cheap to make, and you would look at that and you would think that there's something wrong here, but I see it as like maybe almost too much of a good thing. If you look at like the current meta of the game, you will see a lot of the same decks that are performing the best, but you're gonna see a lot, and I mean a lot, of like, I guess you'd call them like rogue strategies that are doing well, if not just as well as top decks. Like, they're doing just fine, and there's enough of them that come out with every set that it's less of these decks are cheap because they're bad. They're cheap because they're all really strong, so it's not like they can really focus the value on a set on any one deck. And I think that kind of leaves it open for a lot of people to get at a set what they want out of it, and it makes it very approachable for new people, I think, especially if you don't focus on a generic too much.
Yeah, I mean, Levidross, like you were saying earlier, obviously, you know, one of the best generics to run in it is Inlet Pulse, because you're 4 attacking in the deck, you're going to get extra card draw. It's got a kind of unreasonable price. It's way down compared to what it used to be, but it hasn't had a reprint, and I kind of get why it doesn't, but I think it should. But it's a $20 card, so I mean, you're spending $80 there on its own right. Like, that's kind of unreasonable to some people, and that's understandable. But I mean, there are so many generic Stoicheia cards that are just good in it. So, I mean, making do with what you got from the sets, and even just any of the generics that you get from any of the current Divine set. You have the hostage denying cards that just came out. You got the last set with the grade 2 boosting cards. I mean, there's a bunch of like double rare generics that have been added in these last coming sets that are just, you know, cheap. Like, it's actually kind of crazy. They're, you know, not overly commonplace per se at the top meta list, but, you know, meta conversation versus budget and like player friendly conversation is two different stories. So but looking at the, you know, introductory player, or, you know, kind of someone who's just looking for pieces, everything's fairly reasonable.
Yeah, it says a lot about the current state of Vanguard to say that good strong decks don't take much, and don't need you to search through like a million other different sets to find super old stuff that might be super relevant, or this or that or the other. Like, you can go to your locals still with a Stride deck, and that will still be the case when more Stride decks come out. I think those are probably the hallmark of a budget deck, or like a competitively cheap deck, and that it's self-contained to itself in the same way that like these decks in these new sets are, but they do a little bit more for the player by getting all those cards together for you, instead of having to like look up a deck list and figure out what's actually supporting your boss unit. But even then, especially from Divine Set 1 onward, I would argue almost every deck that has been introduced in this era have been self-contained in their sets, and then you need to see like maybe 1 or 2 cards afterwards to put in to keep it updated and doing something new and fresh to keep you playing it. I don't think there's enough that's really wrong with the secondary market of the game that can do anything too detrimental to it.
Yeah, at least currently, and it looks like the case going forward is, Bushy has a very good idea, and they've done a very good job of balancing all these decks and introducing new mechanics that keep people wanting to build decks. I mean, like Auto Mod for Impaldio is just very fun. Levidross's Infinity Eyes markers. Like, I mean, there's all these sorts of things. Like, yeah, okay, it's similar to this one thing, but also it's different enough to keep people entertained. So there's a lot going on with these decks, but yeah, you don't have to go very far to make them work.
Yeah, I think what some people miss when they look at prices of these decks, and they think about generic cards and needing to get them, or the idea of needing to have them, there is a mindset you have as a person in this game already, where you just like the game enough to be like, okay, there's a new set coming out, yeah, I've got to update like maybe this deck or this deck, but what new deck can I build? And then you're like, all right, you get to a point eventually where you're like, man, I have so many decks and I've spent maybe so much or so little money on them that the game starts to feel expensive. But you have to remember that like those were all of your choices you made, and you got yourself here. Where if you look at maybe the most casual player, or just the person who likes that one kind of deck, where they're like, okay, I don't really see anything in any other nation that like, we know people like this, like the Dragon Empire guy, like they only really play Dragon Empire decks, and they don't really spend money on upgrading or building decks. They might spend a lot of money on like sealed product. I know there are some people who do that mostly for like the trade value of it and to like help cards circulate in their locals, but for the most part they just play the one nation, and they might build like something else every once in a while just to keep things fresh. And I think those players, well, not saying they're like the target for Bushiroad, they're definitely treated the best by them, I think. Especially if they're very deliberate with what they want to play and how they want to pick up cards. Being aware of like places that offer case splits and stuff like that, versus just like buying a bunch of boxes and hoping you pull the stuff for your deck or whatever.
Yeah, and with our one of our previous videos talking about using the online resources for those kinds of things, making Vanguard is not necessarily big in every shop, so it is what it is. It's getting there, and it's growing in our area, and I'm sure it's growing elsewhere. Obviously it has to be, because Bushy's still putting a lot of effort into the US market on these things, so it makes sense. And seeing all of the tournament show ups and results from the BCS tournaments throughout the states, and Canada, Mexico, all the above, it's pretty good. So having those online resources, being able to buy, like, oh, I just want a play set of all the rarity like cards for this nation because I want to have the generics. I don't care about rarities. You can find every single one of those splits for fairly good prices, and there's a pretty good competitive market for it. I mean, obviously Facebook and things like that, discussing those things with other people. It just shops like 50 cards or, I'm blanking on the other one, but there are a bunch of places that you could buy a lot of splits like this that just, get you what you need, and you don't need all the other crap. So, in reality, getting what you want targeted, obviously you can buy individuals, but if you just want like a bulk of, hey, I just want this, no other randomness, I don't want all the extra, I don't need 80 copies of this one common card that you would get by buying a case or getting an entire nation split. You just get what you need. So pricing and everything for that kind of stuff is so easy, and it's so accessible to so many different people from everything.
And it's a really good thing to have as part of your thought process for when you buy cards, because you can look at like everything in a set and you'll see that like, okay, I could get a case split for like a Keter Sanctuary in set 1 of Divines, all right? But, I don't really care for Resile at all, but I still want the generic cards. All right, you're gonna wait until the set comes out, or you're just gonna like keep track of pricing of, let's say, a Biscotti, and you're gonna see like, okay, maybe the week she came out, she's like $20. I know she's like $40 or whatever right now, but she's $20 right now. Okay, I will drop $80 on a playset of this generic card that I know I'm always gonna use in all my Keter decks, because I guess I'm a Keter player, or I like this one Keter deck or whatever. What this card does, all that cycle of generic cards, they do a lot for the decks they're in that can fit them, and most decks can. So when you look at card games and you look at a card like that, and you look at a playset of it being $80, you can look at that and say the game's expensive. But if that's all you need from a set, that, in the grand scheme of things, the only card you're buying from a whole month's release schedule, that isn't much. Like, maybe there's some sort of like conversation about price here where we can say like, okay, is $80 for a playset of a card, is that pricing you out of the game? I almost wonder how you're playing it if you can't afford $80 for this game, like in general. Like, if you're somebody who is getting into the game with like a startup trial deck, and you're really only getting what people have left of a case split of just the cards that support those startup trial decks, you're not spending much, if any, money. And there is a place for you in this game, because Bushiroad has been giving you new stuff for those starter decks like every single set. But you will get to a point to where at the end of the day, you have spent quite a bit on the game if you're keeping up with it long enough. And if you know your deck isn't getting supported in an upcoming set, what is really a playset of one generic card to you as a player? Is it really enough to say like, yeah, okay, $20 like the Trey said with Inlet Pulse and like a Levy Draws. Like, you get in the game, you build Levy Draws. Okay, cool. The deck probably didn't cost you much. Down the line, after you've played with it enough, you're like, all right, I know this card is really good for the deck, and it's the only card I need, and it's the only card I know I'm gonna buy in this game for a decent bit. There's not really else. I'm still trying to figure things out, and all that stuff. So that's it. You drop $80 on a playset of one card. At the end of the day, what would you have bought instead? Like packs of cards that you wouldn't use or don't want or wouldn't know how to trade? Like, it's a really easy conversation to have with yourself, I think.
Yeah, and it all comes down to how you really want to play the deck. If it's something that you're not necessarily worried about the draw that you would get from Inlet Pulse, then yeah, you don't have to spend $80. You find another piece that gets you maybe a little bit more power on, like getting Philanders instead. So when you have 10 cards in your drop, you get that extra 10k power. And so you're having a little bit more power on attacks. or having that 18k boost, or even just an 18k attack as your fourth attack. Like, there's all sorts of different options you can go with price-wise to kind of like, play towards your style. So upgrading decks to what you want is really just an internal conversation, and in reality, like I said, most of those main generics that are like, oh, these are really going to be staples in this deck, you don't have to run. Like, yes, maybe if you go to a BCS tournament you might want them, but you don't have to have them.
Yeah, there are Reziel deck lists in set 5 now where half of the deck lists do not even run like the memed to death generic Keter card Teethful. Like, they do not run that card. They just don't. But they still see a lot of the success. And I think that says that should be the thing that will say enough to anybody, I hope, about what a generic card is in this game. Because I know there was a big stigma about them, especially back in, like, I want to say, like, set 10, where they had the Soul Blast ones that went to the bottom of the deck so you could draw a card. Like, people said that, you needed those. And back then, I guess you did, in a way, depending on what your deck was doing. But nowadays, like, cards like those, while they're nice, they're a build option. They are not what a deck build has to include. And that has just become more true over time the longer we've gotten into formats where all these decks have so many pieces of support they've gotten that not are so much pushing out generic cards, but are giving those decks like build options with or without generic cards.
Yeah. Generics really just come down to their toolboxes. I mean, whenever you want a little bit of something, you can throw it in and get it. None of it is ever required. I mean, yes, people will tell you Alden right now, you just Caterpile it. Yes, you run the Wisdom of whatever it is, Order, you run Teeth Faults, you run Saragons, you run Biscottis. Like, yeah, that's what you run. It's 20 cards, and they're all generics that you can run in any Keter deck. But at the same time, there are a lot of good Alden cards that you can still reuse. There's the Grade 2... I'm blanking on the name of from set 13. That's just really good in the deck. It's still a 4 of. There's the Grade 0 promo that they have, and it's still just good, and it's cheap right now. I mean, there's cards in the set. There's an Order that's in the set that allows you to get an additional attack that kind of does the same thing other than Wisdom just ward builds. I mean, there's so many things that you don't have to have, but if you have them, they're nice. Like, I mean, Saragon is just one of the best cards in the game, and for a reason, and that's why it's good in those decks, but at the same time, not required.
Yeah, there's something to say about, do you need that card in your deck when you're not even a deck that cares too much about filtering through itself quickly and, maybe compressing or just like finding certain pieces to do something. Like, I guess Alden needs to do that, but its main gimmick is just that it can call out things really quickly and call over its own units and get benefits off of that, and not be able to have its stuff be retired, and that doesn't require anything more than, what is directly supporting them, especially with the fact that it gets cards like sets before, like, a Destin Alden even comes out, because in Divine Set 1 it got another card that can help enable a 5th attack, and like, this can be said about a lot of decks. Prison is a deck that has like stood the test of time, and it's only gotten good cards lately with its Grade 2 restander, and that card is just not expensive for the reason I stated earlier, that it's not that it's bad. It's not that the deck is bad at all. It's just that it was in the same set as like Blankmire and Zorga, and those decks are both pretty crazy, but they're in a set. They're put into a format that already has really like a lot of really crazy decks that you could play. That there's no way that like these new decks can come out and be really overwhelmingly strong, but somehow still have a much higher price tag than the decks that are already like performing very well. You know?
Yeah, I mean, in reality, the new toy is always fun, but getting that one piece that a deck was missing, like not that Prison was necessarily missing anything, but getting that just extra attack was just something that's like, oh hey, we're taking this product that's like a high B, low A type of deck, and maybe now it's a little bit of a higher A type thing. Like it just makes it that much better. So yes, the scale is always moving with the trends of new decks coming out. They always have to do something to keep decks relevant, so they have to have something strong about them, or something about them that is why you play the deck. Otherwise, they could add 50 new decks, and if people don't care for them because they don't really do anything, they're not going to get played. So yes, everything with this grain of salt, especially in a card game that follows an anime and have specific things that are meant to like kind of counter one thing or the other. Like Blackmire was specifically in the anime to counter Rezile. Like that was the whole plot about it. So yes, that deck is very good in certain matchups, and just generically pretty decent because of its power scaling of just how many bind units it has. It gets power, but in reality, I mean, right now it might be going back up because of the latest card that just came out for it. Vadrock is just very good, and it's pretty generically decent. So it's kind of take those sets with the main like character arcs with a great assault, but still, even then, a lot of these main character decks aren't that expensive.
Yeah, no, Rezile as a deck, I believe, maybe cost me around like $150 or so to put together originally, and I've been playing that deck for quite a while. I would easily say I've got my money's worth out of it and more. And the fact that the next set coming up, set 5, that has probably the biggest upgrades for him, it's 2 cards. It's just 2 cards. The rest of your deck isn't changing much except to accommodate the 2 cards. And even if somehow those 2 cards are expensive enough, I don't think they're ever gonna be like, okay, I'm spending $150 again on these 2 cards. One of them is not even worth being a playset of, but for certain reasons, not because the card's bad, but just because of how the deck plays. So I think that's true of every deck. You play it like what's her name? Chris Rain, and that deck is extremely cheap to build. But then you're like, oh man, a front set comes out and she's like $15, but this is the only deck I play, and I don't really spend a lot of money on this game, especially because building Chris Rain in general was pretty cheap. So I guess I'll pick up I'll pay $60 for this one card, when the alternative would have been spending $60 on a booster box to try to get the card. So what is really bad about this? Not to say these prices are justified or merited, but it doesn't. While the prices can be kind of annoying, especially in niche cases like Inlet Pulse, they're never enough to say that like, oh, the game is suffering because of this. People aren't playing it. It's too expensive to do this, that, or the other. Like, if people want to play the game, they will just play the game at the end of the day.
Yeah, and in reality, you get out of it what you put into it. Like, if you want to spend the $80 to get a playset of Inlet Pulses, I mean, you gotta really want it, and it will just be good. I mean, there are so many instances where it's just that extra card, gives you just enough shield to live another turn, and then you go and beat your opponent that next turn. There's all those instances, and the good thing about generics is they are generic. Like, yes, Inlet Pulse technically has a skill for Flagberg, but one of its skills isn't locked to anything other than 4 attacks. So, it's just good. The new Vadrock Blankmire card is just a counter, or like a soul charger. You just place it, it's a grade 2, it's a soul charge. Like, yeah, it's pretty generic, so pretty good. There are a lot of cards that are like that, so you can just bounce them around. Okay, I don't want to put it in this deck anymore. I don't think it's worth it. I'm gonna move it to this deck that's coming out next, and add it to there, and then you go from there. I mean, they are investments just like anything in these cards, and obviously, if you don't feel that it's worth it anymore, then you can turn around and sell them just all the same, like you bought them. I mean, you might not necessarily break even with it, but you got to take into account the time that you had with it, what you got out of it by using them. I mean, it's just like anything in life in reality.
Yeah, and when you look at the price of a card and you see that, like, oh, this card is $20 or whatever, and how, like, and nobody's gonna, like, it's kind of price skating the people who want to play the deck. But then that can't be true, because in every instance there's gonna be people who are buying that card for that price. Like, as silly as it looks, it would not be that price if people weren't willing to pay for it. Maybe if you see a buyout and it rises, it spikes up for a little bit, you'd be like, okay, yeah, maybe nobody will buy that card at that price, but then it will go down if nobody's buying it, and then people will buy it. Like, that's just how any financial aspect of a hobby works. So yeah, like what Trey was saying, if you're not really in it to play a certain deck anymore, or feeling with what a nation is currently doing, then maybe you should sell your generic cards for that nation. I had a stint with Leonorn over the past month or so where, I'm not quite Trey. I don't have 84 decks. I have maybe like 5 or 6 or 7. But I did a lot of downsizing lately. And it came down to, like, okay, I have a lot of decks. I have a lot of decent decks. I try to stick to one of each nation. And when I looked at the fact that I have enough decks to rotate in my local, a rotation of fairly competitive decks, I just had too many. And Leonorn was a deck I built for the sake of having a competitive Stoicheia deck, but somehow, some reason, I couldn't tell you why. Stoicheia hasn't ever been like a huge focus for me, and neither was Zoo back in the day. I don't know why. I think the only time I was like in love with Zoo was when Asha came out and I loved that deck. I don't know why, but yeah, I made the choice to sell my generic Stoicheia stuff, like, and it was an option I had, and it's an option I will have for other things I might get disinterested in. And I don't really regret it, because, I was able to get those cards in a reasonable way, and then, offload them when I truly got it out of my system in a good way. Like, I had fun with the deck and those cards, but it always helps to change things up and play something new if you feel you're not playing a deck after too long. There's usually a reason for that beyond just, oh, I have these other decks I want to play more.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of maybe the only instances where that doesn't typically apply, because I'm close to 100 decks at this point. So a lot of decks, might not get played for a couple weeks or even a month or two. It just happens just because you're rotating through things. And of course, with a lot of play testing, of these newer decks to see how they're, competitively viable. Obviously, we can see it on, tournament results and whatever, but, until you really play a deck and kind of understand its combinations and like how you want to go about it, I mean, you just have to play it a bunch of times. I mean, like, I played a game which I thought would be super easy of Alakawabra tonight, and I not necessarily was kind of blown away with like how it was. Like, it made me think like, okay, maybe it would be better to go second, because I felt like I could do more, because first turn it was just like I'm hitting for 3 decent sized numbers on grade 1, but then, or my first grade 3 turn, and then second grade 3 turn I was like, okay, I'm hitting big numbers here. But at that point in time I was playing Leonorn, and it was like, all right, Leonorn, if I don't kill Leonorn here, I'm going into Unison Dress, and I don't have the shield and stuff to do that. So it was like, I don't know, obviously maybe just a bad matchup. But some things, you just kind of have to learn by playing the decks. So it's one thing to read cards and be like, okay, yeah, I can do this, but until you actually get the cards in hand, it's a different story.
And that's why, generic cards, or even just cards you think you need for a deck, you might not, when you play with it and be like, okay, this card reads really well, but somehow it's just not doing anything good for that. Like the best example I can think of is when Orpheus Mask came out, and we had the grade 1 that paid a counterblast to dump a World Order from your deck into your drop, and on paper that was super good, but it just didn't come up enough for me to want to have it in my deck and want to spend a counterblast on doing that. Anybody would read that card and they're like, okay, this is insane, it does this and that and the other, but when it comes down to it, it's something that can help, but it's not exactly a strict upgrade, and that's fine. Everything that comes out for a deck, it doesn't exactly need to be a strict upgrade, especially if the deck's already good. But it does, remind you that not every card for a deck that comes out is going to be something that you need in order for it to stay competitive. Some decks just stay competitive naturally by the virtue of how they came out, like Rezile, it's playing set 11 cards and stuff like that. And Cadwalla's, which is a card from I think almost maybe 2 years ago now, there's enough going on in the game that keeping up to date can be important depending on on what deck you're playing, but it's not exactly the be all end all.
Yeah, and every card has its place and player to play it. So, although the competitive list might be cookie cutter and they run everything the same, or 49 out of 50 cards the same, and then one person has this one random tech because they think it's useful. I mean, there's so many things that people can do with this and build and have fun and change things up to get different. Right now, we have a great example of that. Orpheus. You play Orpheus Regis as it's just a, kind of the older style of the deck, but with some of the newer support and added. I still have the Mask version built out because, well, first off, I don't play it enough to really get into the fine details of trying to decide between one or the other. I think the Mask is fun. It's one of my only Mask deck in general, so I keep it set up that way. But similar archetype, same kind of boss unit, but we just play them differently. So I mean, everyone has the ability to do that because they can. So
yeah, I think that's I think we could go on forever about it, but I think that's a fine place to end it here. At the end of the day, it's just one of those things. I don't think this conversation will ever really go away. There's too many people who think that cards are expensive or they get bothered by the price tag of something, but at the end of the day, it's part of every card game, and it's a little silly to me to think that there's any exclusivity in it or that it's going to hinder this game as if it hinders others, really. Yeah.
That's life, and just play the game and play it the way you want to play it. If you don't want to spend a bunch of money, then don't spend a lot of money. Spend what you can and play it and enjoy it.
Yeah. So with that, if you watched all the way to the end, thanks. If you like this kind of stuff, be sure to like the video and subscribe to check out when we're gonna upload more stuff, especially if you hit that bell so you can get notified for stuff like that. And check out the V-Road playlist for a lot of our quite a large amount of videos now. We've been going for a while, and there's a lot you can probably pick up on and figure out for yourself. So until the next one, I was Cole.
And I was Trey.
And we'll see you later.